Working drummer.
Now kick it.
This is the Working Drummer Podcast, serving up perspectives, experiences, and stories from ground-level working pros. Advice, tips, and secrets on how to build a career in the music business.
Hey everyone, Zack Albetta here, and thanks for joining me for another episode of Working Drummer Podcast. My guest today is London-based jazz drummer Pete Cater, who for over 2 decades now has been the drummer and band leader of the Pete Cater Big Band. Under his leadership, the band has remained at the forefront of big band jazz in the UK, and Pete is widely regarded there as the keeper of the flame when it comes to the music and style of Buddy Rich, Joe Morello, Mel Lewis, and many others. For those of you keeping score at home, this is our 99th episode, which means that next week, Matthew Krause will be bringing you the 100th episode of Working Drummer Podcast. Matt has something pretty cool in store for that, so you don't want to miss it, and I'd just like to take this opportunity to congratulate Matt and Mike in advance on this milestone and thank them for bringing me along in 2016. In fact, it was almost exactly 1 year ago that my first interview for the podcast went up. So it's been a great year and a great experience for me, and I look forward to much more. Today's episode is sponsored by Sonar Drums, and here's Matt to tell you a little more about that.
We all love vintage gear, and I bet you know someone that owns an old Les Paul or maybe a 56 Fender Strat that never leaves the home, and the question is, why do we love this gear? It looks cool, it gives you that warm, handcrafted tone, and often brings a unique vibe to the music. Of course, it has its limitations, and if we're talking drums, we run into problems like its fragility, limited tuning. So where am I going with this? Well, once again, I went back out to KHS America in Mount Juliet, Tennessee, to spend some time with some vintage gear. I'm talking about the Sonar Vintage Series kit. I had seen and heard these at Summer NAMM, but now I had a little one-on-one with these beautiful drums. Some specs you should know that make these drums a modern vintage kit. The shells are that hand-selected premium German beech shell with rounded bearing edges. Keep in mind, this comes from the same forest of beechwood trees that were used in the manufacturing of Sonar drums from the 1960s. The recreated teardrop lugs are a big deal. They look and feel just like the original, but now it has Sonar's exclusive tune-safe system. In other words, they stay in tune. There are many beautiful finishes you can choose from, like the Vintage Pearl and my favorite, the Red Oyster. It looks, sounds, and feels like a vintage kit, but maintains the quality and reliability of a modern kit. You could really call this a modern vintage kit. So go to us.sonar.com to learn more about the Vintage Series and find a dealer near you.
So I hope you enjoy this talk. Pete goes in depth about the art and science of big band drumming, Buddy Rich mythology versus fact, and much more. Let's get to it with Pete Cater. You're known for keeping the big band tradition alive and keeping the Buddy Rich tradition alive specifically, but you mentioned in previous interviews that Buddy Rich was not your first influence, that it was actually your dad.
That's right, yeah. My father was a good drummer. He wasn't a professional drummer. He had, at the time I was born, he had a day job with General Electric. Mm-hmm. But back then in the 1960s, there were so many opportunities for musicians. He was able to be out doing gigs 5-6 nights a week. He was very much I didn't feel his absence, but he was out working all day and playing every night.
Wow.
And of course, the drummers of my father's age, because relatively speaking, my parents were comparatively old when I was born. They were both in their early 30s, mm-hmm. Which for that time in the UK was quite unusual. Parenting tended to be a thing that people got into in their early and mid 20s.
Right.
So my parents, being that little bit older, were not of a generation who had in any way been influenced by rock and roll. Mm-hmm. So the music that was playing in the house when I was very, very young was things like Sinatra, Tony Bennett, Mel Torme, and lots and lots and lots of Dave Brubeck. So the first big drummer for me was Joe Morello, and what a great place to start.
Yeah, there isn't a better place to start in jazz drumming as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think a lot of people talk about how certain individuals get a head start in life because maybe they're born into a family who are very wealthy, mm-hmm. Or family with amazing connections in the music industry. But for me, my big start in life was my parents' fabulous taste in music. And the fact that my dad played drums, and he was a good player, and there were drums around the house. He had a little practice set, the toy drums that my brother and I used to play with, all this good music on records and on the radio. And I just thought every home was like that. This was just the most natural part of my childhood, was being around drums.
Yeah. I want to jump ahead to the style that you exhibit in your playing today, and from what I've seen, you look to me like a hybrid of Buddy Rich and Joe Morello.
Perfect.
I have my own observations about why that is, but I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
You couldn't be closer to the mark, Zach. That is absolutely right on the money. And I think the reason is this comes back to how very, very young I was when I first began to be influenced by these players. And I think that the formative influences, the people that you hear when you're first starting out and you don't know anything, and it's all very new and very exciting and very impressive. As I say, you don't know anything, but also I was so young that I was, childish optimism. I thought anything was possible, and I am. That is as good. I mean, I have a number of other very, very important influences as well, but they don't present in quite so obvious a way as those big two guys do. You're absolutely spot on.
Right. So, like, how did you start? Sort of. I mean, other than Morello and Buddy. Who were some of your other early influences, and how did they sort of first converge to form your identity?
Again, it was just the music that I heard. I mean, I wasn't one of these young kids who was only exposed to jazz, like listening to Elvin and John Coltrane from early childhood. Not at all. I mean, I loved pop music as well. I loved the Beatles. I remember seeing Hard Day's Night on television when I was about 10 years old and going out the following day and playing the soundtrack.
Yeah. And
that made me very excited about being in the industry. But for all the rock drummers that I loved, Ringo, I was particularly fond of Ian Pace. For all that I loved those guys and what they were doing, they didn't make me want to play. They didn't give me this very, very visceral, deep, profound inspiration that the jazz drummers did. And the other players that I heard very early on included Shelly Manne, Cozy Cole, because of course Cozy had a chart hit in the UK with Topsy in the late 50s, a few years before I was born, and it was one of those 45 RPM records that a lot of people had. And also Ed Thicklin with the Oscar Peterson trio at the time was somebody who I came to very early on.
I got hip to Topsy a few years ago when I lived in LA. I played in a kind of a retro swing group. And the band leader was Mondo Durrami, who was the saxophonist and founder of Royal Crown Revue. And so they did Topsy, and for whatever reason I hadn't been hip to it before, and he was like, I want you to play this exactly the way Cozy played it. And at first I bucked at it. I was like, man, I want to play my own solo. I want to do my own ideas. But the more I listened to it and what Cozy did on that, the more I was like, why screw with that?
that record was again, it's kind of an early influence that was something that made me very aware of the sound of drums and the tuning of drums and the relative pitches, because what Cozy does, as well as being very compelling rhythmically, it's extremely melodic. I mean, some of the ideas that he plays in the solos on both sides of that record, they are like drum melodies. It's very, very much a kind of precursor to what we would associate with Max Roach and guys like that.
Right. And the other thing about that sound, I've talked about this with Jameson Ross before, about how like the bop tuning came after that, like the real high toms that Max and Elvin and all those cats used. But, especially on something like Topsy, the drums still sound like drums. They're still in that mid to low range.
Yeah.
And it really made me kind of fall in love with that sound all over again and kind of really forsake the bop tuning,
Sure. I've never been what I do in small band settings. I do like to crank the toms a little bit, but for me, the bass drum should always sound like a bass drum. I'm not one of these guys who pulls the bass drum right up to where it's in the floor tom register,
right?
Because if I've got like a very identifiable pitch down at the bottom end of the drum set, I don't feel that where ideas, be they comping ideas or soloistic ideas, without that low pitch in the bass drum, I don't feel an appropriate degree of resolution in the idea.
Yeah.
And if you want to leave something hanging in the air, then end your fill on the small tom. And for me, the bass drum is it's like a major sixth chord or a major seventh chord.
Right.
It's got a bass drum. It has a little triangle after it. It's like the tonic on the drum set. There's just so much resolution about what the bass drum does.
Yeah. And I love that, in the recordings and videos that I've watched, I love that you keep the bass drum down in the bass, because I think especially in college, and I was probably guilty of this in college, but in college big bands, the drummers are playing bop sets.
Yeah.
Because they're also studying bebop and they're doing small groups and whatever, but they don't really realize that like that drum set sound doesn't really translate to the big band.
Yeah, but it's only about tuning. I mean, a lot of my working life, I'm out with 20, 12, and 14, which of course Mel Lewis used for pretty much his entire life.
Right.
And it's just about the tuning and having, for me, like a nice kind of harmonic spread from the drum set. I don't want it to be like a really tight cluster all in the kind of middle and upper register. I want to hear as much of a tonal spectrum as I can get from four pieces.
Yeah. So talk about how you worked your way into becoming pro. I assume you were schooled at some point.
No, I didn't have any formal instruction.
Really?
No, as far as playing is concerned. It was just hanging out with my dad. And he didn't give me lessons as such, but he would show me things from time to time. But the real education began for me when I was about 12 years old. I mean, I'd done little things. I played for like I remember playing for a school production of The Wizard of Oz when I was about 9. And they didn't intend to have drums on it at all. I just went into school one day and said, "Can I play drums on this?" And the teacher said, "Yeah, you can." And everybody liked that. But what really happened for me when I was about 12, and I'm quite a tall guy. I'm over 6 feet, and I became very tall very young. So I was able to go out with my dad on gigs and go in at like licensed premises, places where alcohol was being served, and not appear to be underage and not be challenged. So from 12 onwards, and it really then for about 2 to 3 years, I would be out on his gigs 2, 3, 4 times a week.
Wow. Just hanging out.
Yeah, and sitting in, and the more experience I get, I can remember the first time I went along, they let me play 2 tunes, and then the more I would go, and the more these were musicians who were in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. So I kind of got into their way of playing, which made me sound unusually mature for somebody so young. There's a couple of bits of video from my middle teens off television that are on YouTube.
Oh wow!
And it's quite evident there. I'm not filling or soloing a lot. I'm just kind of keeping time and supporting the big band that I'm playing with. But I think for somebody in the middle teens, it sounds quite mature. And this was an osmotic thing. It was an environmental thing of being around musicians who were much, much, much older. And that was a great apprenticeship. I really, I learned everything I could learn from that environment.
Yeah.
As I got older, I had to move on to the next level, the next step, and get into some different contexts and ways of playing.
Right. And that sort of partially answers another question I had about your development, is that you grew up in the heyday of the rock explosion. But you managed to, resist that or ignore that and become a jazz drummer.
Well, I think that's very much a symptom of having grown up in the United Kingdom, where the musicians of my father's generation revered everything that came out of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And we had great British drummers in that style here, most notably guys like Kenny Clare and Ronnie Verrill. Mm-hmm. But to the British musicians at that time, irrespective of what instrument you played, the Americans were we all looked to the West. All the guys of that era, the Americans were absolutely unassailable, and so again, because my dad was not of a generation to have any time for rock and roll at all.
Right.
You could call it a bias or a prejudice, even if you like. So I grew up with quite a lot of his mindset and point of view. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that I rejected, rock music and rock drummers at all. Far from it. But these were not the guys who made me want to play in the way that Joe and Buddy and Louis Bellson and Sonny Payne and all the rest of them.
Right. And whereas, some of your contemporaries were probably hanging out in music clubs and in bands that were, of their generation playing rock music, you were hanging out with your dad's generation playing with those
exactly,
guys.
Yeah. And, what records were they listening to? I remember one guy in one of the bands my dad was in about 1977. He said, I just got this great album by Phil Woods. And I went right out and bought a copy of it. And again, so see, it was kind of like ripples on a pond. It was spreading out from the kind of primary core of influence. Mm-hmm. And I was picking up on what other musicians were listening to. And all my dad and all the drummers of his era, they would meet up in the drum store on a Saturday, and they'd all talk about Buddy and Joe Morello and Louis and everybody else. And then I started talking to players of other instruments, and they all used to talk about Mel Lewis. Mm-hmm. So I thought, okay, well, what's this? And so being part of a generation that this kind of in a very positive way, it makes me old before my time. Right. Because my grandfather was a musician as well, so I kind of got a lot of influence from him too. Mm-hmm. So I'm really about 150 years old.
Well, you look great, man.
Yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it.
What was the gigging scene in London like when you were coming up, and at what point in your development did you kind of reach a point where you were like, I'm a full-time pro drummer? Right.
Well, I didn't actually grow up in London. I grew up in Birmingham, which is about 100 miles away.
Oh, okay.
And London was the Mecca. That was where all the best players were and all the best gigs. Mm-hmm. So I was growing up in a kind of provincial scene where there was a lot of work to be done. You could play all day, every day, mm-hmm. With one thing and another. There were loads and loads of big bands that would just get together and rehearse. And they used to have this marvelous once yearly big band competition where bands from all over the region would converge on this ballroom. And about 10 of them would go at it from like noon till 6 p.m.
Wow.
So in terms of actual professional playing, I had to kind of find a way out of my my local environment, mm-hmm. which was actually quite difficult to do in a strange sort of way because there was so much work.
Right.
If all I cared about was playing all the time and earning decent money, I could have stayed right where I was. But I had this drive to be amongst. I wanted to play with the elite. I wanted to swim with the sharks, and I wanted to be amongst the best players I could possibly associate with.
Right.
And I knew that sooner or later I would have to move to London, mm-hmm. and it was actually later rather than sooner. I spent my 20s in a kind of nomadic odyssey of playing in resorts and on cruise ships and theaters all around the place. And I didn't actually land in London until I was a few weeks shy of my 30th birthday, which is kind of really, really late. So I was really coming from behind. But that had its advantages in a different kind of a way because I already had so much experience.
Right.
I was competing to get into the industry against guys who were 10 or sometimes more, 10, 12 years younger than me.
Right.
And I had so many miles on the clock at that point. I was able to kind of jump to the front of the queue. And inside 6 months, I was working all the time.
Yeah. I had a similar experience. I moved to LA right around my 30th birthday. And prior to that, I had been in Kansas City for 7 years. I went to grad school there. I was gigging all the time. And like you said, there was plenty of work. I was making decent money, but I wanted to go to the mountaintop and and see what was
as I think all players should.
Right, absolutely.
I think we should.
What you were
step
talking
up to
about.
the plate.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go on.
Well, what you were talking about maybe being too old or it being late in the game. I was afraid of that. I was like, is this, I'm 30 years old. Have I missed the boat on this kind of big move? But I looking back on it, I don't think I would have been at all ready when I was, 23 or 24 or something.
Right.
Not just playing wise, but just having the kind of confidence and security in yourself to.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And the safe way for young guys is if they get into one of the London music colleges, I think. Or into one of the kind of subsidized like national type youth orchestras where they have a peer group and like a ready-made support structure.
Right.
If you're just going as I did, just by yourself and just found a place to live, and I knew about 3 people.
Right.
And just hoping to find a way in, which I did.
Yeah.
And you have to be. I think it's probably more. It's definitely more difficult now. It was a lot easier back in the early 1990s when I was doing this.
Yeah, I think the same could be said about LA or New York or any big music town.
Yeah.
But what was some of the first experience you got in London? What were the first gigs that started happening for you?
The very first thing that I did was for nothing, and it was just a trumpet player who I'd met. I've been doing a couple of tours with a West End theatre star who was a singer, and he was out doing some concert tours. And a guy I met doing that called me to do a Monday night rehearsal big band because their regular drummer he'd gone off on an 8-week cruise or something. And I just went to this local band. It was close to where I was living in northwest London. And they actually had some quite big deal players turning up, guys who 20 years previously had been at the top of the profession and were still out going and rehearsing with this band to make sure their chops stayed, because, they were working like 3 days a week instead of 7.
Right.
And they're out there maintaining their chops. And you're looking at this band and you think, well, that's so-and-so. He used to be in such and such a band on the television and so on.
Yeah.
And it was through doing that I got my first decent regular gig, which was for an Irish singer. He was kind of like a European Bing Crosby, but a few years later, a guy called Val Doonican, who'd been a huge television star, and he was still out filling theatres all over the UK. And I got in his band, and we were doing 1, 2, or 3 shows a week. But the money was great, so I was able to live on that completely and have all this time free to be out, going around, chasing around, trying to inveigle my way into the jazz scene in London, right. which took a little bit longer. But because I had this security of having a decent income and having plenty of available time, I was able to explore that and develop that, which is, and I feel very lucky that I was able to do that.
Mm-hmm. How do you think, speaking of the London jazz scene, what's the state of it today? What's the history of it?
The state of the London jazz scene today is that it is absolutely full of great players. It is tens of thousands of guys chasing dozens of gigs.
Right.
And London is such an international magnet. And because there isn't it's quite so identifiable style and sound as there would be, for instance, in New York City.
Right.
There is less likelihood for incoming musicians to assimilate. You can go into any club in London on any given night of the week, and as well as British players, there'll be, I'm talking about guys who are domiciled here, not guys who are over touring.
Right.
You run into Americans, Italians, French players, German guys, Austrian guys from Israel, guys from the Far East, guys from Australia. And the thing is, because there isn't, it's not like you're going to New York and you're going to go and play hard bop.
Right.
In the way, this kind of image that as an outsider, we think about that kind of New York vibe as far as playing is concerned. In London, guys kind of bring a lot of themselves. And so it's much more of a stylistic melting pot. You can hear a very, very broad range of international influence in a way that's probably unique anywhere in the world today, which makes it very interesting and very exciting and also very competitive.
So at what point did you decide I want to be a big band leader? Like, you're going along in London, you've got gigs, you've got income, you're kind of a freelance hired gun.
Yes, all of the above.
Yeah. What made you want to take on the crucible of assembling 20 guys?
Well, I had originally done that back home when I was about 19 years old.
Really?
Yeah. Because there was this very, 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 very buoyant big band scene in the early 80s in the Midlands where I grew up. But none of the bands quite played, or certainly none of the bands that I was playing in were quite playing the repertoire that I wanted to play. So I just gathered together a whole load of players that I liked from various different bands that I was in, and got hold of a bunch of charts from the USA by writers and from bands that I liked, and took my first steps as a big band leader in very early 1983, when I was still 19 years of age.
Wow.
And I kind of, there wasn't, I was going somewhere else at that point in my life. And I probably did a dozen or so, maybe 20 gigs with that band over the course of a year or so. And then, like anything when you're young, it's kind of a fad for a while, then you move on to the next thing.
Right.
Then a few years later, before I moved to London, I was in a band that was kind of a house band in a jazz venue in Birmingham that grew into a big band. And then, so I ended up with all the charts. And after I'd been in London about a year, I'd met a whole lot of really good young players. And there was just this, word got around that I got all this music sitting at home, because I'd brought a few things into one or two bands that I would go and play with them. And a few guys started to sort of suggest to me, they said, well, why don't you do your own thing? Why don't you? And it wasn't like I went out there with this kind of objective in mind. I just met all these really talented young players, and they could do justice to all these charts that I had. And then guys started to bring in original music that they'd written, and it just sort of took off by itself with very, very little effort on my part. But that's how it seems at this distance. Anyway, I didn't go on this kind of crusade of wanting to set this thing up and make it work.
Right.
It was just a very, very fortuitous time. And I was very much around the right people in the right place at the right time. And the band rehearsed every week for about 3 months and then started gigging. And that was in 1995.
Right.
April 30th, 95 was the first job that we ever played with the band.
And what kind of gigs were you doing at that point? Was it like theater shows or just?
No, the theater shows. It was kind of club gigs. It was circuit jazz gigs, and there was a tradition in London back then, which is it's just about hanging on but it was, again, very, very buoyant back then of big bands playing on Sunday afternoons. And as a sideman, you could have your pick of all kinds of places you could go and play. There were a lot of regular venues around London that would have big bands on Sunday afternoons. And I just got onto that circuit and started playing those dates. And then I got a bit of arts funding, which enabled us to record, and then a bit more funding. I'm very good at filling in forms and coming up with the right jargon and buzzwords that people want to read when they're having money, which is very important. And I think if I hadn't done that and pushed it and got the band into the studio and got us out doing better dates, I don't think it would have gone where it did. Yeah. That's not to say that I've spent, all my time ever since, filling in funding applications. I did it twice, once to record, once to do a tour. And I thought, right, if this thing won't have a life of its own without, money, public money coming into it, then maybe it doesn't have a right to exist.
Right.
So, I wanted to just give it that boost so it would, gain a reputation and kind of become self-perpetuating, which happily it has done so.
Yeah, that's something I talked about a little bit with Lauren Costi. At that point, she had been in London for a year and a half, and she talked about just in the short time that she had been there, she had seen kind of a greater commitment on the part of the government and the public to raise money for the arts and to spend money on the arts. And it sounds like that was beneficial to your band in getting it off the ground.
Yeah, it certainly was. It certainly was. I wouldn't be, my career would have a very different shape today had it not been for those circumstances of about 20 years ago. Certainly. Yeah, definitely. And I think we could do a lot more in the UK to support the arts, but we do okay. But jazz is the Cinderella art form, and compared to what they give to the opera and the ballet and the classical and symphony orchestras, we're getting we've got a metaphorical cup with some coins in it. Relatively speaking, but it has got better. And there's more being done for young players, which is fabulous. And, I hope it continues to grow.
I want to talk a little bit about the art and the science of big band drumming, because big band was my gateway drug into jazz. When I
think it has been for a lot of people.
Yeah, and you did a YouTube series. Is it Fundamentals of Big Band Drumming, or? Yeah,
I think that's what we ended up calling it. That, and again, that's something that happened completely by chance. We had a concert in London almost 2 years ago to mark the 20th anniversary of my band. And the guys who were promoting the show got in touch with Rhythm Magazine and said, can we get some, because they knew me, and they said, can we get some coverage for Pete on this 20th anniversary concert that we're doing? And I agreed that I would, just to help promote the show, I would write a few pieces about some basics for, Big Band 101 for guys who've, heard it and maybe been interested in it, but not kind of finding a way in. Right. So I wrote some articles about that. I also gave a rundown of important players that people need to know about. And then they said, well, could we maybe do some video for this? And yeah, okay. And we just rolled up at Bell Percussion in West London, which is a real big hub for drummers. It's it's a fireplace and studio complex and a drum store. It's that's where I met Lauren for the first time. And it's where the guys go there and practice, they go and rehearse, go and hang out. I go there and teach. And so I went up there and we just made these videos entirely with the purpose of promoting this concert. And they have been very popular. I've had a lot of very positive feedback from them. And in a small way, they've kind of enabled me to take another step up the ladder, I think, profile-wise. And even though sometimes we do these things and we don't do them for immediate financial gain,
right?
I think it's important to remember that to play a long game sometime And my wife said, "What? You're not getting paid?" And but the reward comes further down the line. It's just
Yeah.
a little bit of speculation, I think, is a very healthy thing.
Right. So we already talked about some of the things that you touched on in that video series about the tuning and so forth. But without asking you to reenact the entire series, what are a few sort of principles of big band drumming that you think are important for drummers to know about?
Understanding how what the drums are doing relates to what the ensemble is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're phrasing with the band, if you just, you know what charts look like. You just get usually a single line, occasionally a 2-line part with some of the horn figures on it.
Right.
And not just to play exactly what the guys are playing. I mean, if the brass section is going ba 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 da ba, there's no point you just going ba 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 da ba, because all you're doing is underlining their part. There's got to be some rhythmic connective tissue around those figures that's going to help them play their phrases all together in the right place, right where the drummer in the rhythm section, and hopefully everybody is hearing the time. And sometimes the best way to do that is not to phrase at all, or just to play a small part of the phrase inside the greater context of the groove.
Right.
And so that but rather than playing their figures with them, you play around their figures. You play sometimes less than they're playing, sometimes more than they're playing, and it just helps them put their stuff in the right place. And that to me is one of the big keys to making a band sound good. The other one is being able to play fills that are in time.
That was something I made a note about that when I was watching one of your YouTube videos. You said fills are timekeeping.
Of course they are. Yeah. And they've got to get the band from one musical idea to the next.
Mm-hmm.
And, nobody cares how much fusion chops you've got or could squeeze into this space. And sometimes just playing a strong rhythmic shape that is rhythmically cohesive and has a kind of melodic feel in terms of the way you use the sounds of the drum set, with the end goal being that the fills and the setups should sound like complete musical ideas that you could lift out and, if you wanted to, make drum loops or samples out of them.
Right.
That they would sound like complete ideas. And that's what I go for in my fills every time.
Yeah.
Whether it's just a flam on the one to set up a band hit on the end of one or on two, or if it's quite an intricate 4-bar break, it's all got to sound like a complete musical idea.
Mm-hmm.
That is part of the composition. It isn't just something that you've shredded in the practice room 100 times. I'm going to put this in there. Save that for your open drum solo.
Right.
The drum fills should have some relationship to what the band's playing.
Right.
This is one of the.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I was. It made me think of how there's rhythmic content in every chart, in the horn parts, in the piano comping, and in the melody. And I think drummers put too much pressure on themselves to come up with original ideas to inject into the song. And I tell students all the time, like there's content all around you, and you can just use some of it. You can steal that horn figure and do a fill based on that rhythm.
I use my knowledge of melody or rhythms of melody all the time. If I'm playing a tune and if I just want to kind of start generating some momentum in my left hand comping, I'll just think of the rhythm of another melody, and I'll just use that as my starting point. Mm-hmm. And always for solo, I'm always tracking melody, not necessarily the tune I'm playing. As I say, always tracking melody when I'm solo, right. Because if you've got 8 bars to cover, and you can think of the rhythm of the melody of 8 bars of Lady Be Good by George and Ira Gershwin, and use that as your reference, some kind of framework around which you can play something. That's keeping you far more connected to music than counting bars and beats. Because if you're counting bars and beats, you're taking a step away from the music.
Right.
But if you're referencing music all the time and you're playing, you're staying at the heart of where it belongs, where it should be.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I approach it every time. Everything I do, where if I'm playing in different styles, if I'm coming up with grooves or fills in completely different musical genres, I still use the same jazz musician's approach.
The other phrase that jumped out at me when I was watching your videos was this phrase, playing with the right degree of authority.
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about it in the context of this, the tuning of the snare drum and how you tune it fairly high and get a good crack sound so that you can really kind of be on top of the band's sound. But just the whole concept of playing with authority is something that I feel is essential to big band drumming.
I think it's essential to all playing. It's essential when you're playing brushes behind a singer who's singing a ballad.
Mm-hmm.
It's still got to be that. You still got to give something out from how you play, how you emote on the instrument, and just your whole psyche. And we've all worked with people over the years who could be a bit tough. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. And if they sense a little bit of weakness, they're on you. I've seen leaders really get heavy with young musicians in bands who couldn't fight their corner. And in the way you play, you've got to, that confidence has got to come through. And it's not about volume. It's more to do with intensity.
Yeah.
I mean, constantly, guys come to me a lot because they want to get their jazz time feel together. Very often guys who have played very little jazz, and it's an area that they want to develop. And the thing I'm always having to do over and over again is to get them to play the right cymbal more quietly, but with more authority. Yeah. Even if they're just quarters, just ding, 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 ding. And just to mean it and to make everybody listen.
Right. And
you can make everybody listen by playing quietly.
Right. I learned that, I think, somewhere in college when I was playing in a college big band. And, I think, I don't know how it is in the UK, but all over the United States, horn sections are just notorious for playing way back behind the beat, and in some cases, just dragging irreparably. And
we get to be honest, we don't have much of good brass sections in the UK. That's never an issue. We got some fabulous lead trumpet players here, as of course you have in the United States as well. Some of the bands, even some of the pro bands, if you get the wrong guy on lead alto, you can have some real time issues.
Yeah.
Saxophone sections.
Yeah, I think they tend to take the bassy, laid back interpretation and just lay it back way too much.
Yeah.
Particularly with younger bands or bands that haven't rehearsed together a whole lot, the time tends to just die. But as a younger drummer, my instinct was to play louder and just make it obvious to these guys where the beat was and get them to catch up. But I figured out if I play quieter, they're going to shut up and listen to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's nice for them to play. They can, if they're struggling, if they're having to blow really hard,
right.
If their dynamic range is really pushed up, that's going to damage the cohesion of the horn sections. It's going to can play havoc with the intonation. So you just got to find that balance where you can make the band listen and make it comfortable for them to play. Because if you're going to get 15, 16 musicians all to play together at 280 beats per minute, you've got to make them comfortable. Right. You've got to make it feel comfortable for them. And you can make it feel comfortable by kind of getting right onto the front of the beat and keeping it there. Mm-hmm. But it's about, I can't remember who it was. I was at a National Association of Jazz Educators convention Anaheim over 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big lessons that I learned from listening to one of the clinics there was the whole idea of playing in order to make other people sound good.
Mm-hmm.
What better advice could there possibly be than that?
Yeah. And I think playing with authority comes with, or I think it's gained by, gaining the trust of the band.
Yeah.
And it's about, like you said, making Phil's timekeeping and, playing at a volume that they can play with.
And having absolute unshakable self-belief as well.
Yeah.
When you sit down to play, knowing that even if you're wrong, you're right.
Right.
And that doesn't have to be, that's very much implicit rather than explicit.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just sit down and, you just not without being in any way aggressive or unpleasant or contrary around people, you can just give off a vibe in your persona where you know exactly what you're doing. You can be quiet and humble and pleasant to be around.
Right.
But when you sit down and play the drums, everybody knows where it's at.
Yep.
And there's no better example anywhere in the entire history of music for that than Steve Gadd. I mean, Steve is just you couldn't meet a more chilled out, humble, kind, considerate, wonderful guy than Steve.
Mm-hmm.
But when he sits down to play the drums, it's business all the way.
Yep.
And he is so tapped into this thing of helping other musicians to sound good. And, if it works for him, as of course it does, then you can't really go wrong by following that pathway, I think.
Yeah. I had a similar experience with Harold Jones, the great Count Basie drummer. He came to my school when I was in college to do like a residency week-long thing and do clinics and play with the band and so forth. And the first time I saw him play with the band, because it was the same thing. Like you meet him and he's this super nice guy, just all smiles, gracious and warm and wonderful. And he sat down on the drums and they counted off a tune. They went 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and like on beat 3 of the count off, Harold's entire body language changed. Like he locked his eyes on the ride cymbal. Like he sat up straight and like it was, I am the law. This is business.
Yeah. You lay down the law of rhythm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I want to talk about Buddy Rich and your relationship with him as a drummer and as a sort of follower of his. What are some of the misconceptions about Buddy that you think need to be dispelled?
People just hear the spellbinding fast hands,
mm-hmm.
and there's way more to him than that. I think he's very, very misunderstood by a lot of people,
mm-hmm.
and people just are dazzled by the technique and don't hear the tremendous musicality. For me, Buddy is all about detail. It's some of the little things, the subtle things that he will do
mm-hmm.
that just pass a lot of people by, and they're just. I think sometimes the band would come to my hometown once or twice a year, and I think you have a lot of people sitting there in the audience just waiting for the drum solo to happen.
Right.
He was. When you are your own boss, when you're the leader, you can be an autocrat as far as the time is concerned. You can put it any way you want it, and he had that unmistakable authority in his playing. He swung like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I remember an era when a lot of the young drummers my age all thought they were too hip for Buddy Rich.
Right.
And they have seen the error of their ways. They have all these years later. They have found enlightenment.
Right.
And there's so much. I like the. I just wrote a piece for a magazine that's coming out shortly, and the end of it was one particular time when I got introduced to him backstage prior to a show in 1980, And he went out on stage and played absolutely incredibly, and it was almost nonchalant. It's just like, he just could have been, he could have been walking to the corner store. It wasn't, there was 100% commitment on the show, but the freedom and fluidity with which he played, there was almost this casual, this effortless supremacy about what he did, and that's one of the things I love. He did. You can't say that he made it look easy, but he made it look effortless.
Right.
Which, that's not the same. He just seemed so in charge of what he would do, and he, like all the rest of us, he was allowed the occasional mistake. If you listen carefully to some of the records and some of the reissued tracks that weren't issued first time round, you can hear. I can think of an 8-bar drum break that is actually 7 bars and 3 beats long. I love the humanity of that.
Yeah.
But for me, drummers like that, they show us the level of attainment. They show us what can be done, and they show us what should be done. And I can't think of any reason why anybody at all who is serious about playing wouldn't want to be, in their own way, the best possible drummer it's possible for them to be. I mean, I've been sitting here today. I just came up with some new variations on my personal hand technique, which is something that my technique is different to a lot of other drummers, particularly as far as traditional grip is concerned, because I don't put the fulcrum in the way that drummers normally do when they play traditional.
Right.
And recently I just found another dimension to that. So here, I've been playing drums now 52 years, and I'm still finding new stuff that I want to do. We're still trying to do new stuff and get better at it. And this constant lifelong process of learning and self-improvement, and most importantly, sharing that with other people as well. That's to me, that's what it's all about.
Yeah. And, Buddy evolved as a player, I think, over the years, particularly in the 70s. He started kind of assimilating more pop styles, and his band started playing more, pop influenced music.
Yeah, definitely. This actually, it's almost as though you've read this article that I wrote, because this is another. I love the Verve, the action-packed jazz at the Philharmonic sessions and all the things from the 50s. But for me, it's what he did from 1966 onwards.
Right.
That identity, that is what defines his playing. That was contemporary music. It was new music when I was growing up. It wasn't like I was having to go into the past. I mean, I had, for the longest time, I had virtually no interest at all in what he'd ever done with, Tommy Dorsey or Artie Shaw. And I came to that a lot later, just to get a kind of an all-round perspective on the body of work. But what is really interesting to me, and it's something that never gets talked about very much, and not as much as it should, is that period from 1962 to 1966 when he was playing with Harry James's band, and is playing kind of, it's the Buddy Rich in his late 40s is a much hipper sounding drummer than he was in his mid 30s. There's new stuff going on. There's new concepts as far as phrasing. There's more. It's almost like he suddenly discovered space in his solos. Whereas you think of some of the jazz at the Philharmonic records, and he played these incredible athletic solos that are just they leave you open mouthed.
Right.
But when in the 60s he started to, he kept all that. Obviously, he retained all that fire, but it's like he tempered it with a kind of another layer of almost like reflection and space, which, to my way of thinking, made that action-packed, fiery playing all the more dazzling because there was more light and shade in what he did in later years.
Right.
And What is again? There were all these cliches knocking around when I was young. Drummers used to say, "Oh, Buddy Rich, it's old fashioned, and he can't play rock." I never heard him play rock. I only ever heard him play jazz with jazz musicians. I mean, if there's any bootlegs of him sitting in with rock bands, I haven't heard them.
Right.
But he did what so many drummers do: took from new areas of influence and kind of remodeled them in his own image. And I love some of it. I love his approach to funk playing.
Yeah.
And I love the Buddy and Soul record. A lot of people don't, but there's some stuff on that is just so hip.
Man. And it doesn't sound like he's not playing funk like Harvey Mason.
No.
It definitely still has that Buddy fire and that Buddy edge to it.
Harvey Mason wasn't playing funk like Harvey Mason back when that was recorded.
Right.
That wave of guys, Harvey and Gadd and all the guys who came to prominence in the 70s, they hadn't come through at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And of all of Buddy's playing, some of that stuff, you got to listen to the shout chorus of Love and Peace on the Buddy and Soul album. It's like 2 bars band, 2 bars break. And it's pure magic. And some of that stuff in his playing is some of the most unique stuff that he ever did. And for me, the way he used to play a jazz waltz as well was like nobody else.
Yeah.
He had this really muscular approach. You'd hear him play tunes like Willow Crest and Greensleeves and Goodbye
Norwegian Wood and
to an extent. I think it went when the tempos were a little bit quicker.
Okay.
And he just had this thing going on. You think of jazz waltzes of the bands used to play back then, like Alice in Wonderland and Someday My Prince Will Come.
Right.
And it was all kind of very, very delicate kind of ride cymbal with a little bit of discrete color in between. Mm-hmm. And it was in its own way kind of linear. And then Buddy comes along with this 4-limbed approach that is, and I can actually do quite a good takeoff of it. And it's something that I did it for Greg Bissonette one time, and he just loved it. And those two elements of his playing, I consider to be amongst the most unique things of his. That when you hear them, there's only one person it can be.
Right.
Whereas if you listen to a 1950s Verve album, there are a number of drummers you could possibly, until the solos start, then it's Buddy. Right. But there are, hey, is this Buddy? Or is that? Or might that be Alvin Stoller, or is that Lee Young, or is it J.C. Hurd? Sometimes there's a little ambiguity about who you might be listening to. Mm-hmm. But there's some of those things that he did in later years, it's first, second, and last Buddy Rich and Buddy Rich alone.
Yeah. I heard Peter Erskine talking about Buddy, and without being disparaging to Buddy at all, Peter said, in a way, Buddy kind of ruined big band drumming. And what he meant by that was that, students and young drummers who are learning how to play big band often go straight to Buddy Rich and that really out front, drums as the leader kind of concept, when really they should be looking at Mel Lewis. Well,
I've often said that, and I have to disagree with Peter in this regard, because the young drummers, and I don't wish this in any way to sound patronizing, if you've got a young player who's 11, 12, 13 years of age, he might not be ready for Mel Lewis. He might not be ready to listen to ABC Blues or some of that stuff. The subtlety of what Mel was doing might be a little bit obtuse for somebody that young. Mm-hmm. This is one of the things why Buddy is so important. It's one of these things that doesn't get said. He was this kind of everyman virtuoso. Mm-hmm. Anybody could walk in off the street or come home at night and switch channels on television, and without knowing anything about drums or knowing anything at all about jazz, or without even knowing who he was, you're looking at greatness.
Right.
And this is where the gateway is to be found. Because if you show that to a young player, just as I'd heard him from regularly on records from when I was about 5. And a couple of years later, actually saw him on television. And it was actually seeing him that had the impact. And that made me go for it. And, we have to have the gateway. And I don't subscribe to any kind of point of view that Buddy in any way ruined big band drumming at all.
Well, I think what he meant by that is that young drummers try to do too much too soon.
We've all overplayed at some point,
right?
On the videos of mine that we were talking about earlier, I did a little piece about overplaying on there, where I deliberately played fills with way too many notes.
Right, I remember that. A couple of those fills sounded like fills I do.
And I actually got some very positive feedback about it because, although there was too much in them, I made sure they ended in the right place. But yeah, it's just part of the growing up process, and anything. This was like there was a lot of controversy when the Whiplash movie came out, around about 2 years ago, and I felt very strongly that there's so much negativity in various media about it. And I thought, well, anything that is bringing this type of music to a young audience for the first time, if just a few of them come out of the cinema thinking, oh, that was really cool, I really like that music. What was that tune called? Is that tune called Caravan? Is that other tune called Whiplash? Mm-hmm. Oh, who was it written by Hank Levy? Who's Hank Levy? What else did he write? Mm-hmm. I like Hank Levy's music. This is how it starts. This is, none of us are born into this life fully formed.
Right.
Aesthetics is something that is grown, it is developed, and it's a journey, and you find your way. And some drummers may, they may never get the sheer beauty of Don Lemon playing with Woody Herman's second herd in the late 40s. Mm-hmm. But I hope that they do. And what I'm trying to do, without being, because I don't consider myself a retro player at all.
Right.
I've just been around a long time, and I've been playing long enough to have been very deeply influenced by the people we talked about when they were still with us and at the peak of their powers. But I'm not, playing vintage drums or wearing vintage suits or watching a black and white television with only 2 channels on it. In the interest of authenticity. But I think those of us who have, been fortunate enough to live through that whole era, you can tell I've been talking a long time. Those of us who have been fortunate enough to have lived through that whole era owe it to the young people who are coming around now to give them as much insight as we can into what it was really all about and what it still is really all about, in the hope that they might feel inspired by some of what they hear and what they see, and pick it up themselves and take it forward and do, maybe do something completely new with it, which would be amazing.
Have you read the book, The Torment of Buddy Rich?
Yeah, I have. I think that's the best book about him that I've ever read.
I do too. It's the
Mel Torme book was very good, but a lot of it's about Mel Torme. But the John Minahan book I thought was very, very insightful.
Yeah,
really.
Talking about what it's all about. Buddy placed a high value on playing live and communicating with an audience, which I think you do too.
I do. Yeah.
And I think the reason that he got a bad rap in some ways. I mean, you hear the bus tapes of him like screaming at his band. But when you
can I just talk about that for a moment?
Yeah.
I know guys who were in the band when those tapes were recorded, and I believe, and none of us can be certain. This is only conjecture. I believe that Buddy was to some extent aware of their existence. Mm-hmm. But the tragedy for me is that there are people out there who can probably recite whole chunks of those tapes because they heard them on Seinfeld or something.
Right.
And they don't know Big Swing Face from Bugle Call Rag. They play them a Buddy track, they wouldn't know what it was.
Right.
And I think it's a bit of a shame that it kind of adds to the sort of the kind of the sort of street legend thing.
Right.
But I think it's a bit of an it's like some of the books that were written about Sinatra, particularly the one by Kitty Kelly, which was a knockdown, drag out, no holds barred revelation of everything that Sinatra got up to in his life.
Right.
Which I mean, I read it 3 times, but I thought it was nevertheless a somewhat unnecessary intrusion. And I do believe that a lot of times, and this is particularly hard to get your head around in our modern social media age, a lot of times we just should kind of enjoy what these artists have given to us in the way they chose to communicate with us as listeners, as audience members, and kind of leave it there.
Right.
I've employed a number of musicians who were in Buddy's band, and they've all got great stories about him. They're always universally warm in their recollections of how he was as a man, even if there were, sometimes, should we say, moments of unpredictability. But that's a personal matter that that belongs to his memory and to his family. And I don't care to be involved with it. I just love the playing. I love the music.
Yeah.
And as long as he was nice to the people closest to him, then that's good enough for me.
Right, and that's one of the reasons that I'm such a fan of the Minahan book, is because it really humanizes Buddy.
Yeah, very much so.
And for those who are not hip to it, John Minahan was a journalist and a friend of Buddy Rich who traveled with him a lot and saw the public Buddy Rich and the private Buddy Rich.
Yeah, and that book actually started off as a small article in a souvenir tour brochure.
Right.
1974, and he expanded it into this really very, very interesting, thought-provoking, and I think in a great many ways very insightful kind of a book. As you say, it very much humanizes him.
Yeah.
And
it put the bus tapes in context for me, because the book talks so much about just the passion Buddy had for music and the love that he had for audiences and the commitment that he had to give his all every single performance. And the way that he expressed it might not have been terribly constructive, but those bus tapes and the fury that Buddy was kind of famous for, I think, came from his perception that the guys in his band were not giving as much as he was. They weren't as committed as he was. And he even the book talks about him, dressing down audience members in his club if they were talking. He would be like, would you be talking during a symphony concert? This is American classical music. Shut up and listen.
Yes.
So it really, like I said, it really humanized him for me.
I think so.
And put his kind of psyche and his legend in context.
Yeah, and it's so good that Minahan wrote that when he did, because these things cannot be done retrospectively. They can't be done posthumously. You have to have been there to really have that kind of insight. Otherwise, it's just conjecture. Do you know what really winds me up, Zach? I'll tell you, and there's a lot of them on YouTube. It's when you see some, with whatever intent, somebody posts a little video done in their bedroom with a snare drum or a practice pad or something, and they say, Buddy Rich's left-hand technique explained. It's like, you must have seen him. You must have seen him. And it's like, actually, no, it's your left-hand technique. And, the only person who could have told us what Buddy was really doing when he was playing, how he was thinking about what he did with his hands, if he was thinking at all, or if it was just so many years down the line that it was just completely second nature. The only person who could definitively answer any of these questions would be Buddy himself. And, he's sadly 30 years gone now, and he's the only guy who could answer those questions. And it's fascinating to indulge in a little bit of conjecture. But what I always say to my students, whenever you see something that another drummer who you really admire is doing, and let's use Buddy's left hand technique as an example. Don't try to do what they're doing. Find your way of doing it by looking at every element of what they do and every element that, just start with a blank sheet of paper, look at how your hands work, what your fingers will do, whatever it is you want to do on the drum set. Take the inspiration from the master players, take it apart, undo all the nuts and bolts, so you've got this great pile of bits and pieces in front of you, and then find as many different ways as you can of putting it back together.
That reminds me of, I did an interview a couple weeks ago with Herman Matthews, and I asked him about, trends in drumming, whether it's the gospel chops thing or whatever else, and which trends you choose to assimilate into your playing. And he talked about, how each of us as a player has certain tendencies, certain propensities, and some trends are going to come along that kind of complement your style or complement your body, the way your hands and feet work. But sometimes you just got to let something go and say, that's not the kind of drumming I want to do. That's not the kind of drumming that I want to strive for.
Well, I think that's a great indicator of maturity and wisdom. Because, particularly with some of the colleges that I've taught at over the years, the students get so overwhelmed by course content, and they feel that they're very much under pressure to be able to do everything. Nobody can, ever has, or needs to do everything. And to me, the attainment of maturity and wisdom is knowing what you want and knowing what you don't want. And that may have a bearing on your lifestyle. It may have a bearing on how much money you earn, the kind of life you're able to lead. But I think having the integrity to play the instrument the way you want to play it is something that everybody should strive for. Don't get me wrong, the young players who I'm sending out to college now, as well as my private students who are in their 20s and 30s, I'm telling them, go out and be whatever the industry wants you to be. Go out there and play to the demands of the industry, whatever is the hip thing, whatever is the perceived current style. And I think you're probably quite a bit younger than me, Zack, but I remember in the 1980s when suddenly everybody started playing black Yamaha recording series drums.
Yeah.
Then a few years later, they started playing cherrywood Yamaha recording series drums. And these things that, because of the people who are the most influential at the top of the industry, they trickle down to everybody else. And that's a kind of a lazy example on my part there of, equipment and replica drum sets.
Right.
But in playing terms, these things become part of the everyday vocabulary.
Yeah.
And a lot of it kind of rises to the surface and becomes what's expected of drummers. And you can never really second guess what the next trend is going to be. But I think the young professional players really should get as close as they can to doing that. Do what the industry wants you to do. Because if you can do that, you're going to travel the furthest.
Right.
And, when you're 41 years old and you got gold records on every wall of every room of your £5 million house, or maybe not, because that kind of material attainment is not what everybody wants.
Right.
Then, as you kind of you can say, all right, this is why I learned to play, and this is why I consider myself to be one of the most fortunate drummers out there, because all the stuff that made me really excited about drumming when, before I was even 6 years old, is all present in my professional life now. And I'm exactly the drummer I dreamed about being when I was a very small child, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it is. It's cool to watch. It's cool to hear. And it was great to talk to you, man.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Many thanks to Pete for sharing his time and expertise with us. Again, that book is called The Torment of Buddy Rich by John Minahan. I recommend it as highly as Pete does, and we put a link to it on the episode page for Pete's interview at workingdrummer.net. and also check out his YouTube series entitled Pete Cater's Guide to Big Band Drumming. A lot of great information in there. Again, Matthew Krause is back with you next week for our 100th episode, and as always, thanks for listening.